the day Jasper Hayes rode into Callow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1884. He did so with the particular kind of silence that only guilt can carve into a man's bones over the slow passage of many years. He came from the north, down off the high mesa where the juniper trees grew twisted by the wind, and the dust of the trail had turned his dark coat the color of old rust. His horse, a sturdy quarter horse named Cobalt on account of the blue-black sheen of his coat, picked his way carefully down the switchback trail, as if he too sensed the weight his rider carried. Jasper was 33 years old that spring, lean and square-jawed, with dark eyes that had the look of a man who had not slept easily in a very long time. There was a stillness about him that people often mistook for strength, but those who knew the difference between stillness born of peace and stillness born of endurance would have recognized it immediately for what it was. He had been 18 years old the night everything went wrong. That night lived in him the way an old arrowhead lives in flesh that has long since closed over it, buried, yes, but not gone, pressing from inside with a dull and constant ache. He did not speak of it. He had not spoken of it to anyone since the circuit judge had looked him in the eye in the town of Raton and told him that the law saw no wrongdoing, that boys who did foolish things in the dark of night and caused accidents were not criminals by the letter of the law. The judge had meant to comfort him with that verdict. Instead, Jasper had walked out of that courthouse feeling more damned than if they had locked him in a cell, because the law's absolution meant nothing at all against the verdict he had handed down to himself. For 15 years he had drifted. He had worked cattle drives out of Texas, had worked fences in Colorado, had spent 2 winters as a hired hand on a sheep ranch in Arizona Territory, where the loneliness was so complete it was almost beautiful. He sent money when he could find out where it was needed anonymously, through lawyers and bank drafts, to the family whose lives had been changed by that night in Raton. He never signed his name. He never went back. He had worn his guilt the way a man wears a brand pressed into the skin of his chest, hidden under his shirt from everyone he met, but always there when he pressed his hand to himself in the dark hours before dawn. Callow Creek was a town of perhaps 400 souls in a valley between 2 red rock ridges, and it had the look of a place that was trying to decide whether it wanted to survive or give up gracefully. There was a mercantile store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Brush Fair that had a faded sign above the door, a small church whose whitewash was peeling, and a scattering of houses along the main street that became adobe and brush further out toward the edges. The railroad had not come to Callow Creek. There had been talk of it, and then there had been silence on the subject, and the town had gone on as towns do, sustained by the ranching families in the surrounding valley and the slow commerce of the frontier. Jasper had come to Callow Creek because he had heard through a man named Potts in Santa Fe that the Bellard Ranch, 3 miles south of town, was looking for a foreman. He needed work, and he needed a place to be still for a while. He was tired in a way that moving had stopped fixing, and somewhere in the back of his mind was the half-formed thought that perhaps standing still long enough might allow something to catch up with him, some form of reckoning or release, he did not know which. He stabled Cobalt at the livery, paid 2 weeks in advance because he believed in paying what he owed, and walked up the main street to the hotel, which was a 2-story building called the Callow House with a deep front porch, and a woman sweeping it when he arrived. He noticed her immediately, the way you notice a fire from across a dark field, not because it is trying to be seen, but simply because light has a nature of its own. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical fashion that still managed to catch the afternoon light in a way that made it look almost copper. She wore a plain brown work dress and a white apron, and she swept with the efficient, unhurried motion of someone who has made peace with the repetitive necessities of labor. She did not look up when he approached the steps, and he stood a moment at the bottom of them before she registered his presence and looked at him with large, steady gray eyes that held no wariness but only a calm and frank appraisal. "You looking for a room?" she asked, resting both hands on the top of the broom handle. "I am," Jasper said. "2 weeks, maybe longer if the work pans out." She studied him for a moment in that frank way and then nodded once and held the door open. "Come on in. $1 a week, meals included. Breakfast at 6, supper at 7. You miss either sitting, you feed yourself." "That's fair," he said, and followed her inside. Her name was Lydia Wainwright, and she was the proprietor of the Callow house, which she had been running for 3 years since the death of her husband, a man named Daniel Wainwright, who had bought the hotel on a hopeful impulse, and then died of a fever in the winter of 1881 before he had made much of a success of it. Lydia had stayed because there was nowhere obvious to go, and because she had, as she explained to Jasper some days later when they had begun to speak to each other beyond the practicalities of room and board, a particular stubbornness about refusing to let a thing defeat her. She had a daughter named Clara who was 5 years old and who had her mother's gray eyes and a tendency to appear suddenly at the elbow of anyone sitting at the supper table and ask them very direct questions about themselves. Clara appeared at Jasper's elbow on his first evening and looked at him for a long time before asking, "Why do you look sad?" Jasper had looked down at her and then at Lydia, who had the expression of a mother who has learned not to apologize for a child who says true things. "I expect I have some old troubles on my mind," Jasper said carefully. Clara considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old. "Mama says old troubles are like mud on your boots. You can't walk right until you scrape them off." "Clara," Lydia said, not unkindly. "It is good advice," Jasper said quietly, and meant it more than he showed. He got the foreman position at the Bellard Ranch, which was owned by a man named Eli Bellard who was 60 years old and whose hands were so cracked and weathered they looked like the dry creek bed that ran behind the ranch house in summer. Eli was a man of few words and considerable respect for anyone willing to work hard without complaint, and Jasper was both. The ranch ran about 800 head of cattle, had a crew of 6 cowboys, and needed someone who could organize the spring drive north to the rail terminus at Las Vegas, New Mexico, some 90 miles away. Jasper threw himself into the work with the dedication of a man who uses labor the way other men use whiskey, not for pleasure, but for the mercy of temporary quiet in the mind. He was at the ranch before sunrise and rode the fence lines until the light failed, ate supper in the bunkhouse with the other men, and then lay on his cot in the small foreman's room at the back of the ranch house and stared at the ceiling and let the guilt come, because he had learned long ago that fighting it at night only made it worse. He still stayed at the Callow house 2 or 3 nights a week when business at the ranch allowed it, because Eli Bellard did not mind his foreman keeping a room in town so long as the work was done. On those nights Jasper ate supper at the long table in the hotel dining room, and Lydia sat at the other end of it with Clara and sometimes 1 or 2 other boarders. A traveling salesman named Horace who came through monthly, and a schoolteacher named Mr. Alcott who rented a room long-term because the school had no housing attached to it. Jasper and Lydia began to talk the way that proximity and shared meals and the natural loneliness of the frontier conspire to make people talk slowly at first, cautiously, with the careful circumspection of 2 people who have both learned that openness comes with costs. She told him about Daniel in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has finished the rower part of grief, not without feeling, but without the rawness that requires others to tread carefully. She told him the hotel had nearly failed twice and that she had kept it running by taking in washing in addition to the board, and by the vegetable garden she kept in the back that she admitted with a small smile, perhaps unreasonably proud of. He told her the surface of himself, the cattle drives, the fence work, the years in Arizona. He said he had done a great deal of moving about and was attempting to do less of it. She heard something beneath those words, he could tell, because Lydia Wainwright had the kind of listening that went several layers deep, but she did not press him, and he was grateful for it in a way he could not have explained. What he noticed about her, piece by piece over those first weeks, was the particular quality of her steadiness. She was not a woman who did not feel things. He had seen her eyes go bright with feeling when Clara did something that moved her, had seen her jaw set in a particular way when the traveling salesman Horace made a remark she found offensive, had seen her stand on the porch in the evening looking out at the red ridges with an expression that was very close to longing. She felt things fully, but she had built a structure inside herself that could hold those feelings without being dismantled by them, and Jasper found himself returning to the sight of that quality in her the way a cold man returns to a fire. He was not accustomed to wanting things. The guilt had done that to him, had made wanting feel like a presumption he had not earned the right to make. But he found himself, in spite of everything, wanting to sit across the supper table from Lydia Wainwright. He found himself taking routes through town that brought him past the hotel, not going in, just noting that the lamp was lit and the porch was clean and she was there. He thought himself a fool for it and went on doing it anyway. The town of Callow Creek had its politics, as small towns do, and Jasper learned them the way a careful man always does, by listening more than speaking. There was a man named Conrad Buel who owned considerable land to the west of town, and who had a habit of making things difficult for smaller landowners and businesses that he wished to absorb or eliminate. Buel was not a violent man in the direct sense, but he used the mechanisms of debt and legal pressure and social influence the way a shrewd man uses any available tool, and several families in the valley had already felt the edges of it. Lydia, Jasper discovered, had felt it too. Buel had twice approached her about buying the hotel at a price that was considerably below its value, citing the difficulty of a woman running such an establishment alone and the precarious state of the town's prospects. She had declined both times with a directness that, by the accounts of those who had witnessed it, had left Buel somewhat startled. Now Buel was applying pressure through the supply chain. The man who owned the freight company that brought goods to Callow Creek was in Buel's pocket, and the hotel's supply costs had quietly increased over the past 6 months in ways that Lydia was managing but only barely. Jasper heard this from Eli Bellard, who had no love for Buel, but also no inclination to pick fights with a man who had 3 lawyers in Santa Fe on retainer. "That woman at the Callow house is tough as boot leather," Eli said, not unkindly, "but Buel's got a long reach and he's a patient man. He'll wait her out if he can." Jasper did not say anything to that, but the particular set of his jaw when he rode back toward town that evening was the look of a man who has filed something away. It was in the 6th week of Jasper's time in Callow Creek that the spring cattle drive north became the pressing matter of the month. He spent 2 weeks organizing the drive with the ranch hands, and during that time his evenings at the Callow house became less frequent, and he found that he felt the absence of them in a way that was uncomfortably specific. He missed Lydia's voice, which was low and direct and occasionally dry in a way that surprised a laugh out of him when he wasn't prepared for it. He missed Clara appearing at his elbow. He missed the particular hour after supper when the dining room cleared, and sometimes, if no one needed anything, Lydia would sit at the end of the table with a cup of coffee, and he would sit at his end with the same, and they would talk about whatever presented itself without the need to make a performance of conversation. He rode out with the drive on a Tuesday morning in late April, leading the 800 head north along the Pecos River Valley with a crew of 6 men, and the sky was the particular deep blue of the high desert in spring, and the cattle moved with the patience of animals that have made this journey before. He thought about Lydia on the first night of camp, sitting by the fire after the watch was set and the other men were asleep, and was honest enough with himself to admit that he was thinking about her with something that had crossed the boundary from simple appreciation into genuine longing. He turned the thought over carefully, the way you turn something over to check for damage, and what he found was that the longing itself was not the problem. The problem was the layer beneath it. The old familiar voice that said he did not deserve the thing he was longing for, that a man who had done what he had done at 18 was not the kind of man who got to sit across a candle-lit table from a woman like Lydia Wainwright and hope for anything. He had been 18, and it had been a winter night in Raton, and he had been driving a borrowed buckboard too fast down an icy road after a night of drinking with other boys his age, because he had been young and foolish, and had believed himself invincible in the careless way of youth. The buckboard had come around a bend and struck a man walking along the road's edge, a man named Thomas Greaves, who had been 42 years old and who had a wife and 2 young daughters. Thomas Greaves had not died that night. He had lived for 3 more days, and then he had died from the injury to his head, and Jasper Hayes had stood outside the hospital in Raton and understood for the first time in his life that he had broken something that could not be unbroken. The law had determined it an accident. Jasper had been sober enough that the judge accepted it as such, though Jasper himself had known he had been less sober than the law required and more reckless than any excuse could cover. The Greaves family had received the bank drafts over the years. He did not know if they knew where they came from or if they had simply accepted them as anonymous charity. He had never allowed himself to find out, because finding out would have required contact, and contact would have required him to look into the faces of the people he had made fatherless, and he did not think he could survive it. The drive reached Las Vegas in 11 days without significant mishap beyond one afternoon when 40 head broke east toward a ravine and took 3 hours to recover. Eli's cattle sold well. Jasper returned to Callow Creek on a Thursday afternoon in early May with the money pouched on his belt and the sun on his face, and the beginning of something in his chest that might, if he was not careful, be called hope. He came back to find that Conrad Buel had moved another piece on his board, while Jasper was away. Buel had gone to the county seat and registered a complaint with the assessor's office that the Callow house was in violation of a territorial ordinance regarding the structural safety of commercial buildings, citing a section of the south wall that he claimed was structurally unsound. The complaint had triggered a formal inspection, and the inspector, who was, Jasper learned from the blacksmith in town, a man who owed Buel a significant favor, had confirmed the complaint. Lydia had been given 60 days to make the repairs or close the hotel. The repairs would cost more money than she had. Jasper found her in the hotel kitchen when he came in from stabling Cobalt, and he knew from the look of her that she was in the middle of a very private and very controlled struggle to hold herself together. The kitchen was spotless and the evening supper was started on the stove, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in her hands that she set face down when she heard him come in. "I heard about the inspection," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Word travels fast." "It's a small town." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the particular precision of someone measuring their words very carefully, "It is a manufactured complaint. That wall has been standing 15 years and it will stand 15 more. "I know that," Jasper said. "What's the cost of the repair they're requiring?" She told him the figure. He did not flinch, but he calculated it against what he had earned and what he had saved, and it was possible. It was more than possible. "I won't take charity," she said immediately, reading something in his expression. "I wasn't offering charity," he said. "I was thinking about a loan. At the going interest rate, written down proper with a contract." She studied him with those gray eyes that always seemed to see a layer further than he intended to show. "Why?" The honest answer was complex, and he did not give it all. He said, "Because Buel is the kind of man who uses the law as a hammer, and it sits wrong with me to watch a decent person get hammered when it can be prevented." A long silence sat between them in the clean kitchen, with the smell of something savory coming from the stove and the late afternoon light slanting through the window. "I will think about it," she said finally, and he accepted that. She came to him 2 days later and said she would accept the loan on his terms, and they went together to the small office of the town's one lawyer, a man named Aldous Crew, and had the terms written out properly and signed. The arrangement was businesslike and dignified, and Jasper appreciated that about her, that she managed to accept help without allowing herself to be diminished by the need for it. The repairs were made in 3 weeks by a local carpenter named Suarez, who confirmed privately to Jasper what everyone already knew, that the wall was perfectly sound and the complaint had been entirely manufactured. When the reinspection was conducted, the inspector from the county seat found nothing to object to, and the complaint was formally dismissed. Buel made no overt move in response, but in a town of 400 people, the entire sequence had been witnessed and discussed, and the consensus seemed to be that Lydia Wainwright had held her ground again, and that the new foreman at the Bellard Ranch had helped her do it. What Jasper had not anticipated was the way that this shared thing, this small practical battle they had fought together, would shift the ground between them. Something that had been forming slowly began to solidify, and the evenings at the supper table took on a texture of acknowledged feeling rather than merely pleasant company. He began to help with things around the hotel in the evenings when the ranch work allowed it. Not ostentatiously, not in a way that announced itself, but practically, a hinge that needed replacing, a section of porch railing that had gone soft, the woodpile that she was managing on her own but did not need to manage on her own. She accepted this help the same way she had accepted the loan, with a frank acknowledgement and no false protest, but also with a watchful quality, as if she was still deciding something. Clara, who watched the adults around her with the total attention of a 5-year-old, had clearly decided. She had taken to sitting beside Jasper at supper and informing him, with great seriousness, about the events of her day, and she had twice now taken his hand to show him something in the backyard with the easy confidence of a child who has classified someone as safe and stopped thinking about it. Lydia watched this with a complicated expression that Jasper caught one evening and did not know how to interpret. He asked her about it later, when Clara was in bed and the boarders had retired and they were sitting in the kitchen with coffee, which had become their habit on the evenings he stayed. "You look like you're working something out," he said. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table for a moment before looking up at him. She has not taken to anyone like that since Daniel died. She was 2 when he passed, so she does not remember him, but she has been. She paused, choosing words. She is a child with a great deal of love to give and not enough places to put it. I worry sometimes about her giving it to someone who won't. She stopped again. "Who won't stay?" Jasper finished quietly. She met his eyes steadily. "Yes." The word sat between them with the weight of a real question, and Jasper was honest enough to feel the full weight of it. He had been a drifting man for 15 years. He had come to Callow Creek for a job and a temporary stillness, and what he had found instead was something that was pulling at the roots of that drifting self with a force he had not expected. "I hear what you're asking," he said. "I am not asking you anything," she said with precision. "I am telling you something about my daughter." "You are doing both," he said, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was close to it. "Maybe so," she said. He rode back to the ranch the next morning with the feeling that a line had been crossed, or perhaps more accurately, that a line had been acknowledged that had been there for some time without being named. June came with heat and the particular blue-white light of the high desert summer. The Bellard Ranch was in the middle of the hard work of branding and sorting, and Jasper was occupied from before dawn until after dark on most days, but he managed 2 or 3 evenings in town each week, and on those evenings the quality of his time with Lydia was different now in the way that acknowledged things are different from unacknowledged ones. They did not speak of feelings directly, that was not their way, but there were small things. The way she sometimes brought his coffee without being asked, the way he sometimes found her watching him with the specific, still attention that a person gives to something they are trying to memorize. The way he found himself telling her small things about his day with the naturalness of someone who has gotten used to having a person to tell. Clara had by now fully commandeered his affections, and he had gone from accepting her attention with careful warmth to genuinely delighting in her. She was a child of considerable imagination who had invented an elaborate world involving the backyard vegetable garden as the territory of a miniature civilization, and she gave Jasper detailed and ongoing reports about the political developments in this civilization with absolute seriousness. He responded in kind, asking about the health of the turnip kingdom and the latest disputes with the bean rows, and these conversations were entirely ridiculous and also some of the best he'd had in years. It was on a warm evening in late June, when he had come in from a long day's work, and Lydia had set a plate for him even though supper was technically over, and Clara had been allowed to stay up slightly past her bedtime because she'd been good, that Jasper looked across the kitchen at Lydia and thought, with the clarity of something finally and fully known, "I love this woman." The thought was followed immediately by the old familiar darkness, the rising of the brand that was always there, the voice that said he had not earned this, that he had no right to love a woman like Lydia when he had been the kind of person who had done what he had done at 18 in the dark of a winter road in Raton. He said nothing of any of this. He finished his supper and said good night and went upstairs to his room, and lay on the bed in the dark listening to the town settle into quiet, and held the knowledge of his own love like a burning coal in his chest, and thought about Thomas Greaves's daughters who would be grown women now, and thought about the 15 years, and felt the weight of all of it bearing down. He did not sleep until nearly dawn. It was sometime in July, on a Sunday when the ranch gave him the day, that he made the decision he had been circling for weeks. He wrote a letter. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than the cattle drives in bad weather, harder than the lonely winters, harder than every mile of all his years of drifting. He wrote it to the widow of Thomas Greaves, whose name he had learned was Eliza Greaves, and who lived still in Raton according to information he had carefully sought through the lawyer Aldous Crew, asking only for the information and not explaining why. He did not ask for forgiveness. He had decided long ago that asking for forgiveness was a thing he had no right to do, because forgiveness was something the giver chose, not something the asker could solicit. He wrote instead what he had never written and never spoken, the truth of that night in full, without diminishment or justification. He wrote that he had been young and reckless and half drunk on the worst night of his life, and that Thomas Greaves had paid the price of Jasper's foolishness with his life. He wrote that he had sent the bank drafts over the years and that he hoped, with whatever hope he was allowed, that they had been useful. He wrote that he thought about Thomas Greaves every day and that he did not expect absolution and was not asking for it, but that he believed the truth deserved to be said by name, signed by the person who bore it, even after 15 years. He sealed the letter and gave it to the outgoing mail rider on Monday morning, and then stood in the street and watched the rider leave and felt the strange, terrifying sensation of something having been irrevocably done. He did not tell Lydia about the letter. He had not told her about Raton or Thomas Greaves or any of it. He had told her the surface, the drifting, the years, but not the thing that had caused the drifting or the reason for the years. The thing about guilt carried alone for a long time is that it becomes so much a part of the self that revealing it feels less like confession and more like surgery, the sense that showing someone that wound is showing them the part of you that might make them look away. Jasper had built his entire expectation of himself around the idea that this thing would always turn people away if they knew it fully, and so he had never allowed anyone to know it fully, and the loneliness of that had become as familiar as the guilt itself. He thought, in the nights after sending the letter, that whatever reply came, and he was not certain a reply would come at all, would be a kind of settling of accounts that he needed before he could say anything true to Lydia. He owed her that honesty, he knew. If she was going to make any decision about him that touched her life and her daughter's life, she needed to know what she was deciding about. The thought of telling her was the most frightening thing he had contemplated since the night of the accident itself. In the meantime, The summer moved around them in its heat and light. There was a town social in mid-July, organized by the church, held in the field behind the school on a Saturday evening when the worst of the day's heat had passed. Tables were set out and families came from across the valley, and there was music from a fiddle player named Dre who could make a fiddle talk in a way that made the legs want to move of their own accord. Lydia came with Clara in a dress that was not her usual work dress, but a softer blue that made her eyes look almost silver. And Jasper, who had ridden in from the ranch and changed in his hotel room, stood on the edge of the gathering and watched her greet people she knew with the warm directness that was her natural manner, and felt the particular ache of wanting something that seemed very close and very far at the same time. Clara found him within 5 minutes and took his hand and pulled him into the gathering, and Lydia turned and saw him, and the expression that crossed her face before she composed it was brief and entirely unguarded, and it went through him like a plucked string. He danced with Clara, which was ridiculous because she was 5 and had no coordination but enormous enthusiasm, and then he danced with Lydia, which was not ridiculous at all. She fit against him in the loose, turning dance with the ease of something natural, and her hand in his was warm and certain, and they did not speak while they danced, but there was a conversation happening anyway in the particular quality of her attention, and the fact that she did not look away. After the dancing, there was a moment when Clara had been collected by a woman from the church who was organizing the children's games, and Jasper and Lydia stood at the edge of the field in the twilight with the music floating across the summer air, and she said without looking at him, "Are you happy here, Jasper?" The question surprised him with its simplicity. "I am," he said, and then, because it was true and he had stopped lying to himself on the small things, "happier than I have been in a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad of that," she said, and there was something in those words that meant more than they said. He wanted to tell her then. Standing there in the summer dark with the fiddle playing and the children laughing at the far edge of the field, he wanted to tell her about Rattan and Thomas Greaves and the 15 years. But he was waiting. He was waiting for whatever came back from Eliza Greaves, because he did not know what that would mean for him, and he needed to know before he asked Lydia to take it on. He was a patient man in most things, but waiting for that letter was not patience so much as sustained dread. It came in the first week of August, on a Wednesday, when Jasper was in town to pick up supplies for the ranch, and the mail rider handed him a thin envelope with a Rattan postmark. He carried it unopened for 2 hours, through the completion of his errands and the loading of the supply wagon and the return of the wagon to the ranch and the unhitching of the team. He sat down on the fence rail in the late afternoon light and opened it. Eliza Greaves had written in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the hand of a woman who does not write often but means every word when she does. She said she had known the bank drafts came from him. She had known for a long time. A mutual acquaintance in Rattan had seen the original bank authorization and recognized his name, and the information had come to her some years after the drafts had begun. She had not known how to respond, and so she had not. She wrote that she had spent many years in bitterness about the night of her husband's death, and that the bitterness had been justified and had also cost her considerably, and that she had eventually, through her faith and through time, arrived at a place that was not entirely bitterness. She did not say the word forgiveness. She said she was glad he had written. She said her daughters were grown and doing well. She said she did not know what use the saying of it would do either of them, but that the truth, as he had written it, was the truth, and she appreciated that he had finally said it plainly with his name on it. She closed with a single line that Jasper read 3 times. She wrote, "I do not believe a man who has spent 15 years trying to make right what he did wrong is beyond the reach of something better." Jasper sat on the fence rail in the August heat and held the letter in both hands and felt something shift inside him in a way that had no simple name. It was not relief exactly, because the weight did not lift entirely and he had not expected it to. It was something more like the moment when a wound that has been infected finally begins to drain. A painful process, not a comfortable one, but the beginning of a process that leads toward healing. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his vest, next to his chest, next to the brand that had been there for 15 years. He went to town that evening. Lydia was on the porch when he came up the street, sitting in the rocking chair with what looked like a mending project, and she watched him come with that particular attention of hers. He came up the steps and sat in the other chair without speaking for a moment. "You look like you've had a day," she said. "I've had a day," he agreed. He was quiet for a time, watching the street in the long evening light. Then he said, "I need to tell you something I have not told anyone." She set the mending down in her lap. She said nothing, just gave him the full quality of her attention. He told her. He told her about Raton, about the winter night, about the borrowed buckboard and the drinking and the road, and the terrible sound of impact that he had heard in the echo of every dark and quiet night for 15 years. He told her about Thomas Greaves dying 3 days later. He told her about the judge's verdict, and how he had walked out of the courthouse more condemned than if they had jailed him. He told her about the bank drafts and the years of drifting and the reason for the drifting, which was that he had been unable to make himself stay anywhere long enough for anyone to know him fully, because full knowledge of him included this. And this, he had always believed, was the thing that would make him unlovable. He told her about the letter to Eliza Greaves and the letter that had come back. He told her all of it, and his voice did not break, but it was not steady either. When he finished, the evening had deepened around them, and the street was quiet, and the first stars were coming out above the red ridges in the east. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was low and certain, "I do not see what you see when you look at yourself." He turned to look at her. "You see a branded man," she said. "You have worn it for 15 years, and you are convinced it is the most visible thing about you. But Jasper, it is not what I see." "What do you see?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I see a man who has spent 15 years trying to be accountable for something the law absolved him of. I see a man who sent money to a family who did not even know where it came from, for 15 years in the dark, without asking for any credit or acknowledgement. I see a man who was 18 and foolish and made a terrible mistake, and who has not once made peace with himself about it, and who has carried it alone every single day since." She paused. "I see a man who was kind to my daughter from the first evening he sat at this table. I see a man who helped me fight a manufactured legal complaint without making me feel beholden. I see a man who has been honest with me at every turn about everything, except this one thing that he was too afraid to say." He was looking at her, and something was happening behind his eyes that he had no way to stop, because no one had ever said anything like that to him, not in 15 years, not ever. No one had ever looked straight at the thing he was most afraid of and said, plainly and without flinching, "I do not see what you see." "Lydia," he said, and his voice broke on her name. And then, for the first time since he had stood outside a hospital in Raton at 18 years old and understood what he had done, Jasper Hayes wept. Not loudly, not with any performance of it. He pressed his forearm over his eyes, and his shoulders moved, and the sound that came out of him was the sound of 15 years of a dammed river, finally finding its break. A sound of grief and relief so commingled that they could not be separated, because grief and relief in such proportions always are the same thing. He wept for Thomas Greaves, who had been walking along a road minding his own life. He wept for the daughters who had grown up without a father. He wept for Eliza Greaves and her bitterness and her faith and her single line about a man trying to make right. He wept for himself, for the 18-year-old who had shattered something and spent 15 years trying to atone for it in isolation and silence and motion, because he did not know any other way. Lydia did not speak. She moved her chair close to his, and she put her hand over his, and she sat with him in the warm August evening while the stars came out above the ridges, and she did not look away or minimize or rush him toward composure. She simply stayed, which was the exact thing he had never allowed anyone to do. When it passed, and it did pass because these things do, leaving a strange, clean quiet behind, he scrubbed his face with his other hand and sat for a long moment breathing the warm evening air. "I have not done that since I was a boy," he said finally. "I know," she said. She had not let go of his hand. He looked down at her hand on his for a moment and then looked up at her. The expression on her face was not pity. He had been afraid on some level that it would be pity, because pity would have been unbearable. It was not pity. It was the expression of a woman who has looked at a complicated, broken, trying man and decided something. "I love you," he said. It came out with the simplicity of something that has been known for a while and is finally being said. "I love you and Clara, and I am aware that I have just told you the worst thing about myself in the hope that you would still—" He stopped. "Jasper," she said, with the warmth of a woman who has also known something for a while. "I have been in love with you since approximately the third week you sat at my supper table and asked my daughter her opinion on the political situation of the Bean Rose." He laughed. It was unexpected and entirely genuine, the laugh of a man who has just cried and is surprised by joy, which is the best kind of laughter there is. She was smiling at him with her whole face, those gray eyes bright in the last of the evening light, and he brought her hand up and pressed it to his mouth without quite thinking about it, and she let him. "I am still going to carry what happened," he said, because he would not be dishonest about it. "That does not stop because I said it aloud." "I know that," she said. "I am not asking you to stop carrying it. I am saying you do not have to carry it alone." That sentence, those 8 words, were the most significant thing anyone had said to him in 15 years. He felt them settle somewhere in his chest and stay there, and whatever had been locked around his heart since that night in Raton, not gone, but finally, genuinely loosened. They sat on the porch for another hour, talking about small things and large ones, and when the night had properly come, she said she needed to get inside and check on Clara, and he stood when she stood, and she kissed him, once briefly, in the way of a woman who has decided she is allowed to. He rode back to the ranch under a sky so thick with stars it looked solid, and for the first time in 15 years Jasper Hayes did not stare at the inside of his tent and let the guilt grind over him in the dark. He thought about Lydia. He thought about what she had said. He thought about a life that was not defined solely by its worst moment. He slept. August moved into September with the particular sweetness of a high desert summer giving way to early autumn, and the relationship between Jasper and Lydia moved with it into something that was open now, acknowledged by both of them and by the town, which noticed these things and had opinions about them. The opinion of Callow Creek was generally favorable. Lydia Wainwright was well respected, and Jasper Hayes had by now established himself as a man who did his work well and dealt honestly, and the business of the loan and the structural complaint and its defeat had further cemented his standing. Conrad Buel made no more moves against the hotel, possibly because the failure of his last attempt had been too publicly noted, and possibly because Jasper had a brief and pointed conversation with him at the Brushfire Saloon one September evening that left Buel in no doubt that any future manufactured harassment of the Callow house would be met with equally methodical and public resistance. Buel was a calculating man, not a brave one, and he calculated that this particular pursuit had become more costly than it was worth. The Bellard Ranch was doing well. Eli Bellard, who had the sharp, amused eyes of a man who notices things and keeps his observations to himself until they are irresistible, told Jasper one morning over coffee that he had not seen a man look more settled in himself since he had been one himself, back before arthritis and years of weather had taken the better part of his knees. "I think I may be staying a while, Eli," Jasper said. "Good," said Eli, with the brevity of a man who means it entirely. On a Saturday in early October, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold and the air carrying the first genuine chill of the coming autumn, Jasper asked Lydia to marry him. He did not make a theater of it. That was not his way and not hers. He asked her in the kitchen of the Callow house after supper, when Clara was in bed and the boarders were quiet, and the lamp on the table made everything warm-colored and close. He said he loved her, and he would not pretend to be a man without a complicated past, but that he was a man who would be honest with her and faithful to her, and present in the way he had never allowed himself to be with anyone, and that he wanted to spend whatever years he had left in the same life as her and Clara, if she would have him. She did not make him wait. She said yes with the same directness with which she said everything, and then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him and pressed her face to the side of his neck, and he held her for a long time in the lamplight with the autumn air coming through the kitchen window and the smell of coffee still in the air, and felt the specific, solid, unprecedented weight of a good thing actually arrived. Clara, who had apparently not been as asleep as advertised, appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown and regarded them with satisfaction. "Mama said you were going to ask," she announced. "Clara," Lydia said, pulling back slightly with the expression of a woman who is trying not to laugh. "She said she expected you would get around to it before the winter," Clara continued. "That is enough," Lydia said, firmly and without any real severity. Jasper was laughing. "How did you know I was going to ask?" he said to Clara. Clara regarded this as an obvious question. "Because you look at Mama the way Mr. Bellard looks at his horses," she said. There was a moment of silence. "That is," Jasper said carefully, "a comparison I am not entirely sure how to take." "It is a compliment," Clara said with authority. "He loves his horses very much." They were married by the Reverend Howell at the small white church in Callow Creek on the second Saturday of November, 1884. It was a clear, cold day with the kind of high-altitude blue sky that seems deeper than ordinary blue, and the cottonwoods were bare by then, their gold gone but their silver-gray branches intricate against the sky. Half the town came, which for Callow Creek meant the pews were full, and Eli Bellard sat in the front row with his cracked and weathered hands on his knees and his eyes suspiciously bright, though he would have denied this to anyone who asked. Lydia wore a dress she had made from a blue wool she had ordered from Santa Fe, and she walked down the aisle with Clara beside her, because Clara had refused to entertain the idea of not being part of the ceremony, and they had all agreed that this was correct. Jasper stood at the front of the church and watched them come and felt the kind of joy that has weight to it, that is not light and giddy but deep and grounded and certain. The Reverend's words were simple. Jasper's voice was steady when he made his vows, and Lydia's voice was steady when she made hers. And when the Reverend said they were wed and Jasper took her face in both hands and kissed her, the church responded with a warmth and approval that was entirely Callow Creek people clapping, a few of the older women with handkerchiefs, Clara making a sound of intense satisfaction. The celebration moved to the field behind the church where tables had been set up, and there was food brought by half the town and Dre on his fiddle again, and the afternoon moved into evening with the warmth of a community that knows how to celebrate its own. Jasper danced with Lydia in the cold air under the bare trees and thought about the summer social and how far they had come from that evening, and she looked up at him with the smile that he had decided was one of the finest things he had ever seen in 33 years of living. "Happy?" she asked, because she liked directness. "Extraordinarily," he said. She laughed at the word, which was precisely the response he had been aiming for. They made a home together with the practical efficiency of two people who are both competent and know it, and are not threatened by the other's competence. Jasper kept his position at the Bellard Ranch, which Eli had indicated would be available for as long as Jasper wanted it, and Lydia continued to run the Callow house, which, now that the threat of Buell's interference had receded, and the supply costs had come down through some quiet rebalancing of local commerce that Jasper had facilitated through the county seat, was doing better than it had in years. They paid back the loan from Jasper's savings faster than the agreed schedule required, which Jasper had always intended. When Lydia pointed out that there was no contractual obligation to pay it back faster, He said simply that he did not like owing things, and she said that was one of the things she had understood about him from early on, and let the matter rest there. Clara started school that fall and took to it with the same thoroughness she applied to everything, and in the evenings she now had a father to deliver her reports to. Jasper attended every school performance and exhibition, with the focused attention of a man who takes this responsibility seriously, which made Mr. Alcott, the schoolteacher who had once been a Callow House boarder, smile with the knowing satisfaction of someone who has observed the world long enough to be pleased by it occasionally. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and deep, with heavy snowfall in January that kept the valley quiet for weeks and turned the red ridges white, and transformed the whole world into a simpler, quieter version of itself. The Bellard Ranch lost a section of fence to the snow and spent a difficult week repairing it in brutal cold, and Jasper came home to the Callow house on those evenings smelling of cold air and horse and exhaustion, and Lydia had hot food waiting and did not make a fuss about the state of his coat, only made sure he was warm before she addressed anything else. He told her, on one of those cold evenings, about something he had been thinking about since their wedding. He had been thinking about going to Raton. Not to undo anything or to revisit anything that was finished, but because he had spent 15 years moving away from that place, and he thought it was time to do the opposite. He wanted to go and stand in that town and not run from it. He thought it would close something that was still, despite everything, still open. She listened to him explain this with the full quality of her attention, and then she said she thought he should go and that she thought Clara and she should go with him if he was willing. He was surprised by that. "It is not a pleasant history," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it is yours. And I am yours now, which means it is mine too, to whatever degree you want it to be." He reached across the table and took her hand, and did not speak for a moment because he was not in a condition to speak without his voice doing something unsteady. "I want it to be," he said at last. They went to Raton in the spring of 1885, when the roads were passable and the weather had softened. It was a longer journey, nearly 3 days by wagon, and Clara, who was now nearly 6, treated the trip as an adventure of the highest order and was fascinated by every mile. Jasper was quiet through much of the approach to Raton, and Lydia drove the second half of the last day and let him ride alongside on Cobalt, so that he did not have to sit still if he did not want to. He rode with the specific silence of a man approaching something significant. They did not seek out Eliza Greaves. Jasper had not indicated in his correspondence any intention to appear in person, and he would not do so uninvited. That was not why he had come. He had come to stand in Raton and to walk the street and to be, for the first time since that winter night 17 years ago, simply present in that place without running. He found the road where it had happened. He stood there in the spring afternoon, with the town going about its ordinary business around him, and Lydia standing beside him with her hand through his arm. And he stood there long enough to say, internally and fully, everything he needed to say to Thomas Greaves, not for absolution but for honesty, the same honesty that had driven the letter, the same honesty that had made him weep on a porch in the warm August dark of Callow Creek. Then he turned and looked at Lydia, who was watching him with the steady gray eyes that had seen him clearly from the beginning, and he said, "I am ready to go." "Whenever you are," she said. They stayed one night in Raton's hotel, and at supper that evening Jasper was the version of himself that Lydia had come to know present, attentive, asking Clara about the relative adventure level of Raton versus Callow Creek, listening to her detailed comparative analysis with great seriousness. He looked, Lydia thought, like a man who has set something down after carrying it for a very long time. Not emptied by the setting down, but free genuinely, in the bones free. They drove home in 3 days, and the red ridges came back into view on the third afternoon, and Callow Creek lay in its valley below them, and Jasper stopped the wagon at the top of the switchback trail where he had first come down on Cobalt more than a year ago and looked at the town below. "That is home," he said. Clara stood up in the wagon bed behind them and looked too. Yes, she said, with the certainty of a child who has decided. They rode down into it in the long afternoon light. The spring of 1885 brought news of its own. In April, Lydia told Jasper, with the same directness with which she said everything, that she was expecting a child. He received this news in the way of a man who had genuinely not allowed himself to expect it, with a momentary stillness, and then a joy so complete it was almost disorienting. He put both hands on her face and she looked up at him, and he said, "Are you well? Are you?" "I am very well," she said, with a small smile that meant she was moved. "Stop looking at me like I have announced a crisis." "I am looking at you like I have never been so glad of anything," he said. "That is acceptable," she said. Clara was informed at supper and received the news with scientific interest and a number of very precise questions about the logistics involved, which Lydia answered with the patient honesty she brought to all of Clara's questions. Clara concluded that a boy would be preferable, as she had enough information about girls already, which made Jasper laugh until his eyes watered. The summer of 1885 was a good one. The Bellard Ranch had its best year in 3 seasons, partly due to good rainfall and partly due to the improvements Jasper had made to the cattle management and the arrangements he had put in place for the northern drive. Eli Bellard, who was not given to effusive expression, told Jasper on the occasion of the end-of-season accounting that having a good foreman was like having good water. You did not understand how essential it was until you had the proper quality of it. Lydia's pregnancy was unremarkable in the best possible way, the way of a healthy woman carrying a child without the complications that could make that time terrifying, though Jasper worried about her with a dedication that she found partly touching and partly excessive, and did not hesitate to tell him so. She went on running the Callow house with the usual efficiency, making only the accommodations that were genuinely necessary, and refused to be treated as fragile, which he respected even when his instinct was to insist on the opposite. Clara turned 6 in July and had a birthday supper to which she invited every child from the school who would fit around the enlarged table, which created a logistical event that Lydia managed with calm authority and Jasper managed by moving furniture and making himself useful in whatever way was pointed at. And it was, by all accounts including Clara's exhaustive post-event analysis, a success. In the evenings of that summer, Jasper and Lydia sat on the porch of the Callow house, which was their porch now, his as much as hers, in the warm dark after Clara was in bed, and talked and did not always talk, and watched the stars come out above the ridges. And Jasper sometimes put his hand over the swell of her belly, and felt the evidence of the life there, and thought about the particular miracle of a life that had moved from a winter road in Raton to this porch in this valley, to this very specific warmth. He told Lydia one evening, in the comfortable honesty that had become the texture of their marriage, that he thought often about how close he had come to never arriving in Callow Creek. All the decisions that had needed to go a particular way, the job in Santa Fe that had led him north to Potts's information about the Bellard Ranch, the particular week he had chosen to come, the particular moment he had come up the steps and she had been sweeping and looked at him with those gray eyes. Any one of 100 contingencies changed, and he rides through Callow Creek instead of into it, and the whole thing does not happen. "I used to think like that," she said, "after Daniel died. All the contingencies that had led us here instead of somewhere else, and how different everything might have been. I stopped eventually. Why? Because the contingency thinking always assumes that the alternate version would have been better," she said. "And I do not know that, I only know this one, and this one has you in it." He looked at her for a long moment in the summer dark. "Lydia," he said, "yes. You are the most plainly sensible person I have ever met, and I am extremely grateful for it." She laughed the low, warm laugh that he had decided was the best sound he had ever heard. "Go to sleep," she said. "You have an early start." Their son was born in November of 1885, in the bedroom of the Callow house, attended by the town's physician, a woman named Dr. Ruth Alcott, who was, not coincidentally, the sister-in-law of the schoolteacher Mr. Alcott, and had come to Callow Creek the previous year, becoming one of only a handful of female physicians practicing in New Mexico territory at the time, which she had accomplished through a combination of remarkable determination and the kind of competence that made argument look foolish. The birth was not easy in that final hour, and Jasper spent that hour in the kitchen below with Clara, who had been brought down to keep him company and who held his hand very tightly and told him, with 5-year-old authority, that Mama was very strong and everything would be fine. He was not sure in that hour if he had ever been more frightened in his life, and the fear had the quality of something entirely different from the old guilt fear. This was the fear of losing something beloved, which is both more terrible and more human than the fear of being condemned. When Dr. Alcott came down the stairs with the look of a woman who has accomplished something difficult and well, and told him that Lydia and the baby were both doing well, he stood up from the kitchen chair and had to put one hand on the table for a moment because his legs did something unreliable. "A boy," Dr. Alcott said, with a small, satisfied smile. "Healthy. Good lungs if you can judge by the noise." He went upstairs and found Lydia in the bed with the look of a woman who has done something very hard and come through it, tired in every fiber but entirely present, with a small dark-haired bundle in the crook of her arm. She looked up at him when he came in, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has arrived at the exact right place and knows it. He sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time and looked at the small, ancient, indignant face, and felt the weight of all the years that had led here. Not just the last 2 years, but the 15 years before them. All that drifting and carrying. All that long way around to this room and this woman and this child. And he felt it with the full knowledge that every bit of the road, hard as it had been necessary to arrive exactly here. "Thomas," he said. He had not discussed this name with her before this moment, but she had known, the way she often knew things he had not said, and when she looked at him her eyes were bright. "Thomas," she agreed. They named him Thomas Daniel Hayes Thomas for Thomas Greaves, because Jasper could think of no better way to carry that name forward than to give it to a life instead of a death, and Daniel for Lydia's first husband, because Clara deserved to know that her first father was remembered and honored even in a new beginning. It was a name that carried weight, which Jasper felt was appropriate. He had learned that the things worth carrying were always heavy. Clara met her brother the next morning and conducted a thorough examination of him, and concluded, with the magnanimity of a person who has gotten what they asked for, that he was acceptable, and that she would teach him about the vegetable garden civilization when he was old enough to understand it. The winter of 1885 settled over Callow Creek with a gentleness that felt earned. The Callow house was warm and full of the sounds of a new life. Thomas's early, indignant announcements of his needs, Clara's running commentary on all matters of household interest, the specific domestic music of a family finding its shape together. Jasper moved through these days with the quality of a man who is still sometimes surprised by happiness, not in an anxious way, but in the way of someone who was without it for long enough that its presence still has the quality of something noticed. He wrote to Eliza Greaves again. He told her they had named their son Thomas. He told her not because he expected anything from it, but because he had decided that the honest correspondence they had begun deserved to continue in good news as well as difficult ones. He told her about Callow Creek and Lydia and Clara and the life they were building, and he signed it, as he always did now, with his full name. Eliza Greaves wrote back in the spring. She said she was glad. She said her younger daughter had recently married a good man. She said it was a fine name for a fine purpose. She did not write much, but what she wrote was genuine, and Jasper kept the letters in the inside pocket of a different vest now, because the old vest had finally worn through and he had let Lydia replace it without protest, which had been its own small milestone. Spring of 1886 came in with warmth and new grass on the ridge sides and the creek running high with snowmelt, and Callow Creek had the look of a place that had decided to survive rather than give up gracefully, which Jasper found fitting. The hotel had a full season of bookings. The Bellard Ranch was planning an expansion. Eli Bellard had told Jasper he intended to deed him a parcel of land along the south fence line as part of his compensation arrangement, and they had spent 2 evenings discussing the possibilities, and what had emerged was the beginning of a plan for Jasper and Lydia to build their own house on that land. A proper house, not cramped, with room for the family they were building, with a porch that faced the red ridges. They broke ground in late April, with Jasper and the ranch hands doing the frame work on weekends, and a local builder named Tomás Suarez, the same carpenter who had made the hotel repairs, doing the skilled construction. Lydia came out on Sundays with Clara and Thomas, who at 5 months was being carried in the practical frontier fashion of a baby who goes where his mother goes, and she and Jasper walked the lines of the foundation and talked about rooms and windows and where the kitchen should face, and these were the conversations of 2 people who are building something real and know it. Clara inspected the construction with the thoroughness of a junior architect and offered a number of suggestions, some of which were practical and some of which were imaginative, and they were all heard seriously, because that was how things were done in their family. The house was completed in the September of 1886, and moving in was the occasion of a celebration that involved most of Callow Creek and Dre on his fiddle and tables set out in the new front yard, and the red ridges in the evening light turning the color of embers while people laughed and ate, and the music played across the valley. Eli Bellard stood on the new porch with Jasper in the last of the light and looked at the view, the creek glinting in the valley below, the ridges beyond, the town quiet and small in the middle distance, and said nothing for a while, because he was a man who understood that some things deserve to be held in silence. "You came down off that mesa over there," he said finally, nodding toward the north trail. "I did," Jasper said. "Looked like a man carrying about 3 men's worth of trouble when you showed up." "I was," Jasper said. Eli was quiet another moment. Then he said, "She's a good woman, Lydia." "The best I have ever known," Jasper said without qualification. Eli nodded once with the brevity of a man who means everything he doesn't say. "Good," he said, and that was sufficient. The years moved forward in the particular way of a happy life, not without difficulty, because the frontier was not without difficulty, and they were not people who pretended otherwise, but with the fundamental stability of a life built on honest ground. Callow Creek grew slowly through the late 1880s, gained a second doctor and a larger school, and eventually a telegraph office. And the railroad came to a town 20 miles east in 1889, which changed the commerce of the valley without quite changing its character. Thomas grew from an infant into a small boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a disposition that seemed to combine the directness of the one with the patience of the other, in a way that his parents found both amusing and humbling. He was 4 years old when the new baby came, and he received this news with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has been raised in a household that treats information as information and lets things be what they are. The second baby was a girl, born in the spring of 1889, and they named her Ruth in honor of Dr. Ruth Alcott, who delivered her as she had delivered Thomas, and who received this honor with the brisk, pleased expression of a woman who appreciates recognition, but does not require it. Ruth had red hair from somewhere in Lydia's family that no one could specifically account for, and arrived in the world with the evident intention of running it, which Thomas observed with brotherly wariness, and Clara observed with the satisfaction of an older sister who recognizes a kindred spirit. Clara was 10 by the year Ruth was born, and she had become a person of considerable presence, sharp-minded and warm-hearted, with the directness that was the family signature, and a particular gift for seeing people clearly that she had apparently inherited from her mother. She and Jasper had built a relationship over those years that was its own specific thing, not a replacement of what she had not had, but a real and particular bond between two people who had chosen each other freely, which was, they had both come to understand, the only kind of bond that really meant anything. She called him Pa, a choice she had arrived at herself on a Tuesday morning when she was 7 without any discussion or announcement, simply addressing him that way and continuing with whatever she had been saying. And Jasper had gone very still for a moment and then continued the conversation and had not said anything about it that evening, only found Lydia in the kitchen later and stood in the doorway until she looked at him and saw his expression. "Clara," she said. "She called me Pa," he said, and his voice did what it sometimes still did when something moved him past the ordinary measure of things. Lydia looked at him with the gray eyes that had never stopped seeing him clearly, and she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her in the warm kitchen light the way he had held her on their wedding night, and in all the nights since, with the specific gratitude of a man who knows precisely how far he had come to arrive at this exact place. In the quiet years of the late 1880s, Jasper Hayes was known in Callow Creek as the Bellard Ranch foreman, as Lydia Wainwright Hayes's husband, as the father of 3 children, as a man who paid what he owed and worked hard and dealt straight. He was known for the quality of his stillness, which people had long since understood was the stillness of a man at peace rather than the stillness of a man suppressing something, though those who had known him in the early days of his arrival remembered the difference. He was not a man without history. He had never pretended otherwise, and in a place as honest as the frontier, the people who mattered had learned the outline of what had happened in Raton through the natural channels of time and proximity, and they had drawn the same conclusions that Lydia had drawn on that August porch, that the measure of a man was not the worst thing he had ever done in youth but what he had made of himself after it, and by that measure Jasper Hayes stood very well. He did not forget Thomas Greaves. He had never expected to, and had never tried. There was a specific moment each year, on the anniversary of that winter night in November, when he went out alone in the early morning before the family was awake and stood on the porch of their house and looked at the ridges in the pre-dawn dark and held the memory in full, not with the grinding, branded quality of the old guilt, but with the honest, sorrowful acknowledgement of someone who carries a real thing and knows it is real, and has learned that carrying it honestly is different from being destroyed by it. Lydia always knew when that morning had come, and she always, without fail, had coffee ready when he came back inside, and she always, without any fanfare, put her hand on his when he sat at the table, and they sat together in the early morning quiet before the children woke, and that was its own form of the thing that Eliza Greaves had written. A man trying to make right what he had done wrong is not beyond the reach of something better. In the autumn of 1890, Thomas Hayes was 5 years old and starting school, and Ruth Hayes was walking and conducting herself with the imperial confidence of a 1-year-old who has not yet encountered the concept of limitation. And Clara Hayes was 11 and the best student in the Callow Creek school, by a margin that was beginning to make the question of her future education a genuine topic of discussion. Because the school only went to a certain level, and Clara had already outpaced most of it. Jasper and Lydia had begun to correspond with a school in Santa Fe that took girls from frontier towns and prepared them for further education. And Clara, when this was discussed with her, regarded the possibility with the focused assessment of someone who is taking it seriously and will let them know her conclusions in due course. The house on the south fence line of the Bellard Ranch had by now acquired the look of a home lived in by people who love both it and each other. A garden behind it that was Lydia's domain, and that she was, if anything, even more unreasonably proud of than the one at the hotel had been. a porch railing that Clara had painted herself at age 9, in a slightly uneven fashion that Jasper had declined to correct because it was hers. A hitching post that Thomas liked to use as a balance beam, and from which he had so far fallen only twice, without serious injury. Cobalt, Jasper's blue-black quarter horse, was 15 years old now and no longer suited for the long work of the range, and had been retired to a paddock where he lived in the comfort of an elderly horse who had earned it, and Thomas had appointed himself Cobalt's personal staff, with a seriousness of purpose that the old horse seemed to accept as appropriate. The Callow house continued to run under Lydia's management, with increasing help as the years passed from a woman named Marta who had come to Callow Creek with her husband in 1887, and who was precise and reliable, and who Lydia had recognized immediately as the kind of person it was worth paying properly. The hotel was the most consistently solvent business in town, which people attributed variously to Lydia's management, and to her vegetables, which had developed a genuine regional reputation among traveling salesmen. Conrad Buel had, by 1890, sold most of his western holdings and moved to Santa Fe, the way that men of his particular ambition tend to move toward larger concentrations of power once they have exhausted the smaller ones. Callow Creek did not miss him. The freight company that had been in his pocket changed its rates accordingly, and the ripple of that reached the hotel's supply costs and made Lydia's accounts look the way they should have looked all along. Jasper had by now been offered a partial ownership stake in the Bellard Ranch, which Eli, who was aging and whose hands gave him more trouble each winter, had proposed as the natural arrangement for a man who had been managing the place as if it were his own for 6 years. They had negotiated this over several evenings at Eli's kitchen table with the comfortable efficiency of 2 men who trust each other completely, and the arrangement they reached was fair to both, with Jasper's stake increasing over time and Eli retaining the financial security of his later years without the burden of the daily management. Jasper signed those papers with the specific satisfaction of a man who has, through honest work and years of presence, become part of something that will outlast him. He brought a copy home and put it on the kitchen table, and Lydia read it and looked up at him with the expression that he still, after 6 years of marriage, found so clearly moving that it never lost its effect. "Jasper Hayes, rancher," she said. "Is that what it says?" "That is what it means," she said. She was smiling. "Daniel would have liked you, I think." He looked at her for a moment, taking the weight of that sentence seriously because she had said it seriously. "I hope so," he said. "I think I would have liked him." "He was a good man," she said. "Not without difficulty, but good." She was quiet a moment. "There is room for more than one good man in a good life." He crossed the kitchen and she stood up from her chair, and he held her face in his hands the way he had on their wedding day, and she looked up at him with the gray eyes that had first looked at him on a porch with a broom in her hands and seen something worth looking at. "Thank you," he said. "For what specifically?" "For not seeing it the way I saw it," he said. "That evening on the porch, for saying what you said." She put her hands over his at her face. "I saw a man," she said simply. "A whole, complicated, carrying man. That is what I saw." He kissed her in the warm kitchen with the autumn afternoon coming through the window, and somewhere in the house Thomas could be heard making the sound of a child, engaged in a project that probably involved something being constructed that was not entirely authorized, and Ruth was making the sound of a child who objects to being napped, and outside the window the red ridges were turning the ember color of the autumn evening, and the life that had been built here was entirely and completely real. Some evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet in the way of a house that has earned its quiet, Jasper and Lydia sat on the porch, the way they had first learned to sit together on the porch of the Callow house, without performance or effort, with the comfortable presence of 2 people who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other, which is the only way any choosing works in the long run. On one such evening in the autumn of 1890, With the first cold coming in off the ridges and the stars beginning to appear above the dark shapes of the mesa to the north, Lydia said, "You came down off that mesa over there." He looked at the north mesa. "I did. You looked like you had been walking a very long road." "I had," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the quiet for a while. And the stars came fully out above the ridges, and the creek murmured in the valley below, and somewhere in the town. The lamp in the Callow house window burned its steady light. And above all of it, above the red rock country and the cottonwood valleys and the honest dirt roads of Callow Creek, New Mexico territory. The night was enormous and full of stars, and entirely indifferent to the small human happiness on the porch below it, which is exactly as it should be, because the best happiness does not need the sky to notice it. It is sufficient unto itself. It simply is. And for a man who had worn his guilt like a brand for 15 years, who had ridden into this valley on a blue-black horse expecting nothing more than work and the particular mercy of standing still, that was not a small thing. It was, in the way of all the best things that have been long coming and truly arrived, everything.